George Washington, the father of the nation, a revolutionary general, and our very first president. But behind the legendary status are stories that'll actually blow your mind. How did a regular planter become an immortal figure in history? From his personal struggle with slavery to his gutsy role in the French and Indian War, and his life with the original First Lady, Martha. It was one wild ride. Ready to dive deep into the life of the most influential American leader ever? Let's get into it. To really understand George, we have to forget the stoic face on the dollar bill for a second. We need to look at a kid who was dealt a pretty rough hand early on. Imagine being 11 years old and losing your father. That was George. Most kids that age are worried about games. George was suddenly worried about his future. He didn't inherit a massive fortune like some of the other founding fathers. He had to work, and I mean really work. By the time he was a teenager, he wasn't sitting in a classroom. He was out in the deep, untamed woods of Virginia working as a surveyor. Think about that. No GPS, no cell service, just a compass, a chain, and miles of dangerous, uncharted wilderness. He was sleeping on the ground, dealing with unpredictable weather, and coming face to face with wild animals and indigenous tribes. This wasn't just a job, it was his boot camp for life. It taught him how to read a map, how to survive on nothing, and more importantly, it gave him this incredible mental toughness. He learned that if you want to get from point A to point B, you don't wait for a path, you hack one out yourself. While he was out there in the woods, he started noticing something. Land was the ultimate currency. If you owned land, you had a voice. He became ambitious. He worked for the Virginia Company, and he saw how the big players moved. He realized that being a regular guy wasn't going to cut it. He wanted to be a planter, a leader, someone who mattered. But life isn't just about work and ambition. It's also about the complicated reality of the world you're born into. For George, that reality was slavery. This is a part of his story that is often glossed over or simplified, but it's crucial to understanding who he was. As a young man in Virginia, he inherited enslaved people. At the time, he didn't question it. To a young George, slavery was just the engine that ran a plantation. It was the way things were done. He poured his heart into Mount Vernon. He wanted it to be the most beautiful, productive estate in America. And it was, but that beauty was built on the backs of hundreds of people who had no choice but to work for him. As he grew older, and especially as he began to lead a revolution for liberty, something started to break inside his conscience. Can you imagine the irony? Here is a man leading an army to break the chains of British tyranny, while he himself holds the chains of hundreds of others. He started writing about it in his private letters. He grew to hate the system. He called it unfortunate and unjust, but he was stuck in a trap of his own making. His wealth, his status, and his lifestyle were all tied to this horrific institution. This was his internal war. It wasn't until the very end of his life that he made the ultimate decision. In his will, he ordered that all the people he enslaved be freed after he and Martha passed away. It was a massive statement at a time when almost no one in his position was doing it. It doesn't erase the past, but it shows a man who was capable of growth, even when it cost him everything. Speaking of Mount Vernon, we have to talk about the woman who made it all possible, Martha Dandridge Custis. When George met Martha, she was a wealthy widow with 2 kids. People sometimes think this was just a business marriage because of her money, but if you look at their letters, there was a deep, genuine bond there. Martha was the secret weapon. She wasn't just at home knitting, she was a powerhouse. When the Revolutionary War eventually broke out, Martha didn't just stay behind in safety, she traveled to the front lines. She spent half the war in the winter camps with George. Think about that, the First Lady in a tent in the freezing cold, mending clothes for soldiers and keeping her husband's head on straight while the world was falling apart. She was his emotional anchor. Without Martha, there probably wouldn't be a General Washington. But before the Revolution, George had to learn how to fight. His first real taste of war was the French and Indian War, and let's be honest, at first he was kind of a disaster. He was young, he was headstrong, and he made some huge mistakes. He actually helped spark a global war because of a botched mission in the Ohio Valley. He even had to surrender at a place called Fort Necessity, the only time he ever surrendered in his life. But here's what made Washington different. He didn't let failure break him. He watched, he learned, and he adapted. He saw how the British fought, in straight lines, wearing bright red coats, making themselves easy targets. And he saw how the French and their Native American allies fought, using the trees for cover, using surprise, using the land itself. He realized that traditional European warfare wasn't going to work in America. He took those lessons and tucked them away. He also became famous for his invincibility. During one battle, he had 2 horses shot out from under him and 4 bullet holes through his coat, but he didn't have a scratch on him. People started to believe he was literally protected by God. That kind of legend is powerful when you're trying to lead an army. Fast forward to 1775. The colonies are fed up with the king. They need a leader. They look at Washington, the tall, quiet Virginian who shows up to meetings in his old military uniform. He didn't ask for the job. In fact, he told them he didn't think he was good enough for it. But they chose him anyway. The Revolutionary War was a nightmare. We like to think of it as this glorious march to victory, but it was mostly a series of retreats and near disasters. Washington's army was a mess. They weren't soldiers, they were farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers. They didn't have shoes, they didn't have gunpowder, and half the time they weren't even getting paid. The lowest point was Valley Forge, the winter of 1777. The soldiers were starving. Disease was everywhere. Men were literally leaving bloody footprints in the snow because they didn't have boots. This is where Washington became a legend. He didn't stay in a warm house nearby. He stayed in the camp. He suffered with them. He lobbied Congress for supplies, he brought in experts to train them, and he kept the spark of hope alive when everyone else wanted to quit. He realized he didn't have to beat the British in a giant cinematic battle. He just had to not lose. He used guerrilla tactics, he used spies. He was actually a master of espionage, and he used the hit-and-run strategy to wear the British down. And finally, with the help of the French, he trapped the British at Yorktown. When the British surrendered, the world turned upside down. A group of ragtag colonies had just beaten the greatest empire on earth. After the war, Washington did the most shocking thing in human history. He had all the power. His soldiers loved him. He could have been King George I of America. But instead, he resigned his commission, gave his sword back to Congress, and went home to his farm. King George III of England heard about this and said, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. And he did. But the country couldn't stay away from him. The new United States was falling apart, and they needed someone everyone trusted to hold it together. He was unanimously elected as the first president. Think about the pressure. Every single thing he did, how he dressed, how he spoke, who he met with, would become the rule for every president after him. He was walking on eggshells. He had to deal with Hamilton and Jefferson constantly fighting in his cabinet. He had to deal with rebellions at home and wars in Europe. He had to build a government from scratch, and he did it with this incredible sense of duty. He stayed for 2 terms, and then he did the Washington move one last time. He walked away. He refused a 3rd term, proving that in America, the office is more important than the man. Washington eventually retired to Mount Vernon, finally getting the quiet life he always wanted, though it didn't last long before he passed away in 1799. He left behind a country that shouldn't have existed, but did because of his sheer will. So what's the real takeaway here? Washington wasn't a perfect man. He was a man of his time who struggled with the morality of his actions. He was a man who failed before he succeeded. He was a man who preferred his farm to the battlefield. But he was exactly what we needed. He showed us that leadership isn't about being the smartest or the loudest person in the room. It's about having the grit to stay when things get hard and the wisdom to leave when the job is done. If you've made it this far, it's probably because you care about the stories that shaped our world. Most people just swipe past history, but you're different. You're looking for the why behind the what. If this look into the real George Washington gave you a new perspective, do me a huge favor. Hit that subscribe button. It tells us that these deep dives are worth the effort and helps us keep the lights on so we can bring you more stories that actually matter. And hey, if you have a friend who thinks history is boring, send them this video. Let's change their mind together. Thanks for watching. Stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.